You're listening to Ukrainapodden, a podcast from Nettavisen. My name is Tormod Malvin Sæter, and it's my great both pleasure and honor to welcome Anastasiia Lapatina to Ukrainapodden. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi.
You're a Ukrainian journalist currently working in Lawfare Media. Earlier you worked in the Kyiv Independent.
Yes.
So you're a former colleague of Francis Farrell, which our listeners already know, and you're here in Oslo with him.
Yes, that's correct.
So if you can start with you explaining how we ended up in Oslo this time.
Yeah. So I joke that I have a special relationship with Norway. The first time I was here was in 2022 during a conference that was organized by the Fritt Ord Foundation. It was a media conference that I was invited to. I was the only Ukrainian there. It was me and one other Ukrainian woman and a bunch of Russian journalists and a bunch of Norwegian academics. It was a very interesting experience. But from that time, I remember that I really liked Oslo and really liked Norway and wanted to come back. And I made some really good friends here. And then several years later, actually this last spring, I have just wrapped up my previous project that I was working on, which I think you want to touch on later on. But, I was working on a project about the history of the relationship between Ukraine and the U.S., and I did that for over a year, and that project was wrapped up, and I decided to do a new project about security issues in the Arctic, which, of course, is very much connected to Norway in the Barents region. And so I reached out to some of my Norwegian friends that I made during that initial trip in 2022 and sort of talked to them about it, and they suggested that I come back, and through various friends and connections, I ended up coming to Kirkenes, to the high north, to the Kirkenes conference this past spring. And that was the coolest thing I've ever done in my life, objectively. It was completely unlike anything else I've ever done before. I've never been to the Arctic before. And of course, coming there and seeing the Russian border and hearing all of the stories and understanding the context of the Kola Peninsula and Svalbard and that region was just utterly fascinating. And I met more great Norwegian friends who then invited me to come back again. And that's the third time. That's this week why I'm here. I was invited to attend an event organized by the Norwegian Helsinki Committee. It is the Anna Politkovskaya annual media seminar. And so me and my former colleague from the Kyiv Independent, Francis Farrell, we came together and shared some of the insights and some of our reporting from Ukraine. So that's why I'm here.
You mentioned that the first conference in Norway, it was, you were the only Ukrainian.
It was me and one other woman who was a moderator at the panel that I was in. It was only the two of us, and that's it.
Yeah, and I guess that's an issue you've seen before as well when we talk, like when we in the West talk about Ukraine and Russia, we kind of, some people would say that we spend too much time understanding Russia and hearing from Russia's voices.
Yes, absolutely. It's a huge problem, and it was very much felt back then because it was the spring of 2022. The full-scale invasion had just begun. And the Fritt Ord event, it was kind of clear that they were scrambling last minute to do it, the war began and we can't ignore Ukraine anymore. We need a Ukrainian speaker. And it was a very sort of last minute addition that they invited me. And of course, and I've heard these stories since then as well at all sorts of conferences where there would be a lot of Russian journalists or Russian, so-called opposition leaders in exile who would be invited, and then there would be one or two Ukrainians, and that the lack of balance there is a problem, and it's sad that it's still happening even so many years into the war. But I think it's very important to come to these events when you're invited and to bring that Ukrainian voice. It's because even if you're the only one in the room, which is, of course, a very uncomfortable position to be in because you feel a bit cornered and you feel a lot of responsibility because whatever you say about your country in that setting, that's really going to stick because there's no other voice, there's no other alternative. And yeah, it's a very privileged position as well. I'm very glad to keep coming back and telling Norway and Norwegians about Ukraine.
Yeah, and you call it the so-called opposition of Russia, which is, I think, is also an interesting thing to at least talk a little bit more about, because we in the Western media, we kind of think, we don't write too many critical articles about the Russian opposition, but especially in the discussion inside Ukraine, I guess, for example, Yulia Navalny, the wife of Alexei Navalny, she is not a very
liked person, I guess.
Not a very popular person in Ukraine.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the West has this constant fascination with Russia in general, but ever since the full-scale invasion and ever since, everything happened, there is this constant highlighting of the Russian opposition figures, like Kara-Murza or Yulia Navalny or Dmitry Muratov, the famous journalist who's the editor of Novaya Gazeta, and there are countless other figures, but there's a huge lack of understanding of these figures and what they do and what they don't do and what's their reputation, not only in Ukraine, which I guess it doesn't matter. Some could say that it doesn't matter what we think of them, but also what's their reputation inside Russia or among Russians who are in exile. And of course, I'm not the best person to talk about this because I'm not one of them. But it is true that in Ukraine, there is a complete disappointment with those figures, and there is sort of a lot of critique towards them because very often what they say and what they advocate for doesn't actually align with what Ukraine needs to win. And the people who are doing most to oppose the Kremlin regime are not the Russian opposition leaders in exile who do very little but give press conferences and attend other conferences and write books and articles. The people who do the most for that are the Ukrainian soldiers and the Ukrainian army who are opposing the Kremlin regime in the most direct, kinetic way possible and dying for that cause. And then when you have instances of Yulia Navalny as an example, being asked whether the West should increase military support for Ukraine, and her answering that that's a difficult question because, as she said, those weapons are killing the Russian people, so she's sort of struggling to grapple with that. I think that's completely ludicrous. I think any person who understands the war and what's happening and what is the right thing to do to move forward would unequivocally answer yes. And you can find countless examples of this, of course. And I've had conversations with some Russian journalists in exile here in Norway just this week, and I don't interact with Russian citizens very often. Of course, I'm based in Kyiv, so I just pure geography, it doesn't give me a big sample of them to interact with. But when I do, and when I did this week, I was shocked to find out that they completely agree with this, that they also think that, and of course, again, I've spoken to a handful of people, so I'm not claiming to understand, how every Russian citizen thinks, but the people that I have spoken to also agreed with me that these Russian, and I say so-called opposition leaders, that they're not really doing much, that they're just there. They give speeches, they write articles, and they sometimes advocate for very problematic things, and the West continues to amplify them, they continues to give awards to them and continues to treat them as some sort of representation or somebody to listen to when it comes to Russia, when, in fact, very often they're just profoundly unhelpful. One person I spoke to, a Russian citizen, a journalist, said that, these guys who were POWs, who were, or not POWs, but political prisoners who, were in prison and then were exchanged, what can you say about them? They're brave guys, but that's it. Like, they're not really politicians because they're not doing much. And so it's just it's just frustrating for Ukrainians to see that the Western audience doesn't really see beyond that initial bravery. You know, everyone who was in a prison in Kremlin is by default considered a hero, someone who you should look up to, someone who you should respect. But that's not enough. You have to look a little bit beyond that. You have to actually listen to what they're saying. And very often the things that they say are either profoundly unhelpful or outright extremely problematic.
And as both a Ukrainian and as a journalist, what do you wish that your Western colleagues would do different then, both when we write or talk about Russian opposition, and also when we, for example, if you arrange a conference about Ukraine, like what's your best tips to your colleagues?
Well, the best thing that you can do is to just make sure that at the very least, if you do want to invite Russian speakers and Russian journalists or Russian opposition leaders, at the very least, you should have an equal amount of people who can represent the Ukrainian side. One thing to never do is to equate them and put these people on the same panel. Because, first of all, no Ukrainians are going to agree to that as a matter of principle. So, you know, we can be at the same event, but it has to be separate. Putting Russians and Ukrainians on the same stage and asking them to sort of share their experiences and equating that experiences is extremely inappropriate in the current context. So, you know, I think that's just a good rule of thumb. But in terms of coverage, I think you just need to be learning the context. You know, you have to be looking beyond the headlines and beyond your initial perception of these people. And this is not just about the Russian opposition. I mean, God, there are so many much more important topics, you know, to cover. I think just remembering that the war is ultimately about the front line, and the war is ultimately a long-term situation. That there is no morning after the war that's coming soon. That when we can sort of go back to normal and Russia is going to miraculously change. Because, you know, people ask me, not very often because they think it's a rude question, but sometimes I'm asked, you know, can you envision a future where Ukraine and Russia sort of get along again? Can you imagine a future where you and you can just be friends with Russians and sort of coexist as normal neighbors? And I always say yes, because we have an example of Germany. And I think that's the most appropriate example, because that's sort of the best example we have where, you know, if humanity could grapple with that, and Germany as a country could grapple with the Holocaust, surely there is a chance, I don't know how big it is or how likely it is, there is some sort of blueprint, so there is a precedent that, you know, a country can commit genocide and can commit the worst acts of atrocities in history and recover from that and become a normal part of society. So, you know, but what's important to remember is there's a whole lot of work that has to be done to make that happen. And that work is exactly what we're not seeing the Russian opposition leaders sort of acknowledging and articulating that that's necessary. Nor is there any real chance of that happening anytime soon, because ultimately all of these conversations about the future are, you know, they're all theoretical, and it's not that they're useless. I mean, because we're not policymakers. You know, if we're talking about the general public, we can talk about the future all we want, but it's important to remember that that's not the reality, and that it's not going to be the reality in the short term or to medium term. There's not going to be an end to the war miraculously anytime soon, because that's what the front line dictates. That's how the Russians fight. So all of these conversations about the future and about the opposition and about the future of Russia and the future of Ukraine, they're all a bit misplaced. I think there are more important topics that people should pay attention to.
Yeah, and I guess the same goes with, for example, the discussions that has been in the West about sending some kind of peacekeeping troops to Ukraine, because as long as the war goes on, it's not gonna be any peacekeeping troops anyway.
Exactly. So, you know, the in light of Trump's comeback to power, Europe has joined into this sort of chorus and into this conversation of having to end the war in Ukraine as soon as possible and seeking an immediate resolution, seeking an immediate ceasefire. Of course, everyone understands that it's a charade, that Europe is just following along and doing what Trump wants it to do for the sake of protecting at least some transatlantic unity, for the sake of damage control and making sure Trump doesn't actually withdraw from NATO and abandon Europe completely. But and so from that flows this sort of completely out of touch with reality discussion about security guarantees and about this reassurance force in Ukraine and about dozens of European members who, according to Macron, have allegedly committed to sending troops to Ukraine, which is, you know, to the best of my knowledge, is just not true. You know, 26 countries did not actually agree to that, and it was a profound failure of communication. But regardless, all of these discussions about the reassurance force they say outright that all of this is only possible after the war ends, but they're, for some reason, just completely skipping the actual point of how to end it, which again is completely unhelpful. And completely misguided. And it's not that the idea of a reassurance force is useless in itself. I mean, if we were actually on the cusp of an agreement, and if a ceasefire was actually about to happen, and there were real evidence to suggest that, then of course, a reassurance force for the sake of training the Ukrainian military or something like that. That would be great. I'm not saying that, you know, I don't know, 20,000 European troops in Ukraine is a bad idea to begin with. It could work, but the point is that there is no sign that this can actually be implemented anytime soon. And so it's again this problem of misguided attention and misplaced attention and talking about something that's not relevant to the issue at hand. And the issue at hand is that the Russians are continuing to fight and kill Ukrainians on the front line every day. And there is no sign that they're going to stop anytime soon. And what do we do about that is the ultimate question.
Yeah, and I guess no one has really come up with a good solution to that either. Like Ukraine has, their solution is, of course, to get as much support and weapons from the West, but it seems like there's a lack of willingness from the West to do what Ukraine says is necessary. Is that...
It's a very complicated discussion, and this one question could take up to 5 hours, to be honest. But I think there is a lack of strategic clarity on both sides of the Atlantic, you know, in the US, in Ukraine, and in Europe. And there are a lot of really complicating factors around it. Obviously, the most complicating, probably, apart from the Russians, is Trump and the circus that is. Another complicating factor is that I had a very interesting conversation with a colleague recently who said that, you know, Ukrainians want the US and Europe to be something that they're not. So when Ukrainians criticize the West, which is all the time, that's sort of a permanent state of being, we are annoyed that the US isn't doing more to help us and isn't taking the war more seriously. But the truth is, could the US do more than it's currently doing? Obviously. But it is also true that Ukraine has never been, and very likely never will be, the number one priority of the United States government, or even the top priority of its foreign policy. Because the US exists in this myriad of considerations and priorities that go far beyond Ukraine. It's not good or bad, it's just a fact of reality. Now, this is extremely hard for Ukrainians to grapple with because, of course, for us, this is an existential fight. And it is an existential fight for Europe as well. But the U.S. doesn't see it that way for obvious reasons. The U.S. has other considerations, and that's, again, not good or bad, just a fact of life. And about Europe, Ukrainians want Europe to be more united, more quick, and acting with more urgency and unity, as if Europe is this one thing. But Europe isn't anything one. Europe is dozens of nations, each of whom have their own interests, have their own defense capabilities, have their own domestic defense production, and businesses who have their industries, who have their own interests. And that's a huge complicating factor for European support for Ukraine. It's a huge source of grievance for the Ukrainian people, because we want decisions to come quicker. We want there to be more unity. We don't want to keep explaining to the Germans or the French or any other big nations. Thank God we barely need to explain anything to the Nordics and the Baltics, but they don't have the capabilities that we need, and therefore we need to rely on the bigger players. But those bigger players have other interests. They have voters. They have election cycles. All of those things are, again, just a fact of reality.
History between Ukraine and the US is, I think, very interesting. And you made a whole podcast series about this called Escalation. You made it for Lawfare Media. And if our listeners has not listened to it yet, I would highly recommend it. It learned me a lot about Ukraine's, especially modern history, and how we ended up with... where we are now. Yeah. So can you try to tell me what you wanted to do with the Escalation podcast project?
Absolutely, yeah. So that was a dream come true, because before joining Lawfare to make that show, I was at the Kyiv Independent, and I've done some podcasts, but they were not narrative. That is to say, they were sort of this kind of podcast that you're listening to right now, where you sit down, you have an interview, you have a conversation, but it's pretty chill, pretty informal. There is preparation and work that goes into it, but the narrative podcasting is completely different, because it is essentially a movie in your ears. It's like an audio documentary. So the entire episode of the show, which let's say is 30 minutes, it is entirely scripted. And you make a season like that, you make 6 or 7 episodes in our case, in the case of Escalation. And to do that, you have to make dozens of interviews, and you have to do months of reporting, and there's a lot of sound design that goes into it. There is a lot of sound production that goes into it. It's a completely different ballgame, a completely different level of production. So in the case of Escalation, I was thrilled when I was offered that opportunity to do it, because I've always wanted to do a narrative podcast and I've never done it before. And for Escalation, we wanted to tell the story of the relationship between Ukraine and the US, starting from the 90s, when Ukraine regained its independence in 1991, all the way to the present day, to narrate how did we get here, what was America's role, of course, because Lawfare is an American media, so we have listeners all over the world, but primarily in the US. And we wanted to do that with as little of Russia in that story as possible, because, of course, many of these conversations, if not all, one way or the other, the Kremlin makes its way into them. And we tried really hard. And I think, of course, we couldn't entirely avoid Russia, because it's true that for the US, for decades, it made more sense to talk to Moscow to figure out what was happening in Kyiv or any of the other regional capitals. And that's how the region was treated. And for the podcast, we interviewed more than 50 people. So we've done countless interviews. We've talked to diplomats, to politicians on both sides of the Atlantic, so in the US and in Ukraine, and also European actors as well. We've talked to historians, we've talked to regular people who've just been there to witness some of these events, the 3 Ukrainian revolutions that happened, and the various high-stakes summits, the Bucharest summit, and the invasion of Ukraine in 2014. We talked to a Crimean Tatar activist who lives in Crimea, who spoke, despite still being in Crimea, spoke to us very openly about the experience. And we really tried to explain the context, the historical Ukrainian context for the relationship, but also for some of the events that have really shaped Ukraine. And I think understanding that history is crucial to understanding the Ukrainian fight, to understanding why Ukraine, in fact, did not fall in 3 days, as not just the Kremlin, but many, many highly respected analysts around the world predicted in 2022.
Norway as well.
Norway as well. And understanding why we're still in this fight and why, despite all of the losses that we've incurred, there is no stopping, and there is no giving up, and there is no capitulating, despite all the horror that they've inflicted upon us. So yeah, I'm very proud of that project. You can find it on all audio platforms, anywhere you listen to podcasts. It's called Escalation, and I really hope that you enjoy it.
Yeah, it's a great show, and it's if you're searching for it, Escalation has a lot of seasons. So this is the
latest. Well, it's the Lawfare has done other narrative podcasts before, and so they're all on the same podcast feed. So it's one feed, but all different shows are on the same feed, and only our show is called Escalation. Others have other names, but the feed is now called Escalation. It's the latest season of that, and it will be obvious from the podcast art and from the names of it. The first episode is called Chicken Kyiv.
Yeah, and George Bush's famous speech in Kyiv in 1991. 90?
Yeah, yes, in 1991, I think.
Just before you got your independence.
Yes. And in that speech, he essentially discourages Ukraine from becoming independent and says that he uses different words, he uses vague diplomatic language, but he essentially sides with the Russians. He essentially says that he doesn't support Ukraine breaking away from the Soviet Union for the sake of stability or whatnot. And he does that, and he comes to Kyiv and says that, makes that infamous speech after a visit to Moscow, where he promises Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, that he is going to do that he's not going to go to Kyiv to support Ukraine's independence. So, and this is all very well documented. And yeah, this is just one little taste of how messed up that relationship was in hindsight, of course. Back then it was a different consideration entirely. But in hindsight, it was very interesting for me as a Ukrainian to go back and look at that.
For sure. And I think my kind of favorite part of the podcast is the episode about the Budapest Memorandum, because that's something I guess everyone that listens to this podcast has heard about, but you go into very good details about it and explains how it was made and what flaws it ended up having. So I think that was a really interesting part, and we could be talking about for hours about that one.
Yes.
But what is it that you learned from this podcast series that's is there anything that surprised you the most? Or
absolutely. Yeah. So, of course, I'm a journalist, but I'm also a Ukrainian citizen, and I'm a part of this nation, and I experience the war every day. I live in Kyiv with my family, with my child. So, of course, in my job, I absolutely try to be as objective as possible. But, taking my journalist hat off for a moment, it was very interesting to see in the show that even though there is this narrative that exists in Ukraine, which is largely true, that we've sought support from the West, and we've tried to get Western leaders to hear us and to integrate closer, to be part of the EU, to be part of NATO for so many years. And the West has always been extremely cautious and hasn't sort of let us into that community as much as we've wanted because of the fear of escalation with Russia. Although that is certainly true, that's not the full story. Because there is also a part of the story where Ukraine, in its modern history, in the early 2000s and also later on, is acting in ways that look a lot like what was happening in Russia at the time. Not entirely, not to the same severity, because there are, other considerations there, and, that's a whole different podcast episode. But we've had incidents where we were perceived by the West, rightfully so, as corrupt, as unreliable, as an ally that can't be trusted. And that definitely had an effect on that relationship. So it's not a black and white story at all. And I guess I didn't fully appreciate how things looked like from the American perspective, where it's not that the Americans, loved the Russians and hated us. It's more that perhaps they didn't care about Ukraine in certain moments because they had other priorities. I mean, especially speaking about the 2000s, there's some pretty important stuff that the Americans are dealing with at the time. And in the wake of 9/11, of course, the Russians are using that to the fullest potential to make themselves look like a very close ally and an ally that can be trusted. Putin is one of the first leaders to call Bush after 9/11. And then, of course, you have the incredible comment about I looked him in the eyes and saw his soul, and I can trust him from Bush. And all the meanwhile, the Ukrainian government is doing some pretty stupid stuff and is really undermining the Ukrainian society's efforts to be better, to build a democratic country. So, and there were numerous moments like that. And I guess I didn't fully appreciate how we actually impeded our own fight for democracy and integration with the West as well. And that's an important lesson. It's very important to understand that and not just hold these grievances toward the West, which some of those grievances are fair, but I guess a part of them perhaps is not.
Yeah, I guess it takes two to tango, is
Exactly.
that the saying? So
exactly.
the West
Yes.
has done its fair share of mistakes, but
Yes.
Ukraine as a state has done some mistakes as well.
Absolutely. Yes.
For example, if I remember correct, Ukraine also sold some kind of radar or weapon systems to Iraq.
To Saddam Hussein's Iraq, yeah, that was an incredible story. I actually didn't even know about that story when I started doing the podcast, because it's a kind of story that nobody remembers now and nobody talks about now, and you really have to go and dig in and care about that particular stretch of time in the early 2000s to discuss it. But I don't wanna spoil too much for the listeners. But if you listen to the episode, you will just let's say you will find that Ukraine somehow, after the 9/11 attacks, finds itself on the wrong side of history. It's brief. We end up correcting course, but for a brief moment there, somehow we are not on the right side, and there are very real consequences to that as well. It's one of those moments where we really mess up, and the relationship between Ukraine and the US suffers because of something we did. Yeah.
And I guess we also can say that the discussion about invading Iraq, if that was the right or wrong side of history, that's another discussion.
That's a completely different can of worms that I am not willing to open right now. But
let's not go there.
Yes.
I agree. But one of the problems Ukraine has faced, especially since its independence, I guess it's kind of the Soviet legacy, is the corruption. Ukraine is, so to say, the last 10 years has been going in the right direction in most corruption indexes. Like it's getting better and better. And one of the things that Ukraine did after the 2014 revolution was to create the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, the NABU.
Yes.
And this summer, Zelensky's party passed a law in the parliament, kind of taking away their independence.
Mm-hmm.
And that created mass protests in Ukraine. What happened? And what's the situation now? If we can try to attack that.
Yeah. So, in August this was, right?
August, late July. I remember.
Time is a strange concept these days, yes. recently, let's say in August, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law, a bill that was then signed immediately by the president, that takes away independence from two key anti-corruption institutions. So NABU, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, and SAPO, the Special Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office.
Yeah, because all the cases that NABU investigates go to
SAPO.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it doesn't go to normal court, but it goes to this special independent prosecutor.
Court. Yes.
That
exactly.
Zelensky has no power of. Like he can't influence it.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's worth first rolling back to explain why these institutions are so important and why it was this sort of highly bureaucratic, legalistic, difficult topic that sparked the first protests in Ukraine since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. So after the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Ukraine embarked on its journey to reform the government, to integrate with the West, to become more like Europe and advance its bid to join the European Union. And one of the major reforms that were done is the anti-corruption reform. And that anti-corruption reform established a whole network of anti-corruption bodies that are independent from the standard law enforcement branch of the Ukrainian state. So you have your police, you have your SBU, the State Security Service, you have other agencies, but these anti-corruption agencies that were newly created, they were completely independent from them. They acted as their own sort of ecosystem. So there is the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine that investigates and brings cases to the Special Prosecutor's Office, the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor Office. So that's NABU and SAP. There is also a high anti-corruption court, and those cases eventually find themselves in the court. And then there's also a body that isn't really like a law enforcement body, but it does tracking of assets of politicians and sort of does monitoring and that kind of stuff. And so this infrastructure was built with a lot of help from Ukraine's Western partners, with a lot of money. The EU and the US poured a lot of money into making this happen. A lot of the a lot of the aid that Ukraine received after the Revolution of Dignity came with strings attached and conditions that said specifically that you have to get this reform through, you have to make it happen, you have to open these institutions, and you have to make sure they work. Those were the strings to a lot of the money that Ukraine was receiving. And there were also foreign advisors that helped build these institutions and helped manage them. And these institutions were by no means perfect. They, have been infiltrated by moles who would tell the people who are being investigated that they are being investigated to help them flee the country before they can be arrested. There have been all sorts of conflicts and problems with them that we don't have the time to get into. But the key point was that they were acting independent of the old guard of the law enforcement and independent of the president, of the leadership of the country, with the idea that those independent bodies exist to go after that leadership, right? To clear the Ukrainian government of corruption. You can't, maybe in some perfect society like Norway, you can do that, but in Ukraine, you can't go after, let's say, one of the president's aides and then report to the president about that investigation. It doesn't work like that. It's a massive conflict of interest. And so the Ukrainian society and the civil society saw this reform and these bodies as one of the big wins of the revolution. 100 people died in the revolution fighting for a Ukraine that looks like this, that has bodies that work independently, that has bodies that eradicate corruption. And so it was this symbol of Ukraine's, victory in the revolution and this symbol that this is what we fought for. And it's also, as I've already mentioned, the successful work of these bodies is directly tied to Ukraine's European integration. So when the parliament passed that law and Zelensky signed it in a matter of hours, which is unprecedented, usually bills lay on his desk for days or weeks or are never signed. And here it was clear that this was sort of a top-down directive.
Yeah, and one thing is that it sounded really quick, like within 24 hours, but I think it also took less than 24 hours from the first time we heard about the new law from it was passed in parliament, which is also unprecedented.
Of course, yes. So the way it was passed, you know, with this lightning speed of the bill didn't even exist, and then on the morning of the vote, somebody suggested, well, actually, you know, if you want to get technical, what happened is that there was a bill about something else, and certain very dubious lawmakers who don't have the best reputation, you know, held a sort of a very ad hoc committee meeting in Parliament at like 9 a.m. or something with only a fraction of the committee members present, and they suggested these, what is it called?
Kind of just changes, like
there's a word for it, but I'm forgetting. They suggested these amendments. They suggested these amendments to the bill. They somehow added it to the voting sort of schedule of the day, and so you know that happened there. Let's say around 9, and then around afternoon, around 12, like 3 hours later, the parliament votes for it, and then a few more hours. And then the speaker of the parliament signs it immediately, sends it to the president, and then a few hours later, the president signs it. Like, that is impossible unless the office of the president wants that to happen. Like, it never happens in Ukraine, or I'm pretty sure in any other country. Like, this is a complete disregard for parliamentary procedure that says that if you're adding amendments to a bill, you need to, you know, make these amendments public, because the parliament has to read, like, what are we actually voting on? What are these amendments? And there has to pass some time. There has to be like at least a week of time from the moment that you add these amendments to the moment that they're being voted on. And so this and there is more as well. There are more problems with the process, but it was clear and obvious to everyone that this was only possible because there was political will at the highest level of the Ukrainian leadership to make that happen.
And was some reporting that Andrei Yermak, the Zelensky's top advisor, I guess you can call him?
Zelensky's chief of staff.
Chief of staff, yeah, exactly.
Yes, the head of the presidential office. Well, I mean, yes, the general understanding and the reporting shows that that was his idea, even though he was conveniently out of the country at the time, which was interesting. He was on some work trip somewhere. I think he was in Istanbul during peace talks or something like that, but essentially, yeah, that happened, and the Ukrainian civil society and some of the lawmakers in parliament who very quickly realized what was happening started sort of ringing the alarm and publishing on social media that this is a catastrophe. So what the amendments actually do, they took away the key independence of these bodies by subjugating them to the prosecutor's office of Ukraine, like the office of the general prosecutor, which usually those bodies are independent of that office, and the bill tried to subjugate him to that office. Moreover, the office of the general prosecutor is one of the most, if not the most, politically non-independent, like, offices in Ukraine. Like, a general prosecutor is a presidential appointee, so it's somebody who's handpicked by the president, put in that job, and then somebody who reports directly to the president and is loyal to the president. And in Ukrainian history, some of the worst people we've had who've done the most damage to this country, very often they were general prosecutors. It's a very powerful office, and it's a very dangerous office politically because it's completely loyal to the leadership. So it looked very bad because it took away the independence of NABU and SAPO, effectively rendering them useless. You know, one lawmaker described it to me in a podcast, actually. She said, you know, when the government says, well, NABU and SAPO still exist and they will continue to work just together with the general prosecutor, she was like, sure, the buildings with the plaques of the name NABU and SAPO exist, but their work has been rendered obsolete by that law. And very quickly, various anti-corruption activists and civil society actors started spreading the alarm that this is a catastrophe, that we can't let this happen. And within a matter of hours, thousands of people started protesting, and the protests spread all across Ukraine and lasted several days. I was there as well, in Kyiv. And a few days later, Zelensky reversed the decision and introduced a new bill that reverses basically all of the amendments.
And that was passed as well, even though it didn't happen as fast as the first law.
Yes, yes.
I know it's also necessary to say, I think that Zelensky and Ukraine received a lot of pressure from especially the European Union to reverse this, because there's a lot of deep concerns within Ukrainian allies that why they did this. When this happened, we had Yegor Sobolev, which is a former Ukrainian MP, on the podcast. Now he's now a drone commander. He said that he thought that something good came out of this, and that was that the new generation of Ukrainians, like the younger, around 20, now took to the streets and kind of took ownership to Ukraine's democracy. Is that something?
Absolutely. It was a very inspirational thing to see, where the crowd that went out and protested, particularly in Kyiv, and that's the one that I can speak to the most because I was there and I live in Kyiv, the crowd was overwhelmingly very young. So it was people who are, maybe still in high school or are in university. So it was sort of, as always, as in every Ukrainian revolution, it was university students. And that was interesting because, again, why would a 20-year-old care about NABU and SAP? And it's so technical and so complicated, and these bodies were created when we were kids. I'm 24, so I'm a part of this generation. I'm a sort of, I guess, a part of this crowd that went on to protest. We are the post-Maidan generation. We're the post-revolution generation, where the only Ukraine we consciously remember is a Western-oriented Ukraine. I don't remember the Soviet Union. I don't remember the times when we were friends with Russia. I don't remember any of that. I was on Maidan with my parents during the Revolution of Dignity, and I was around 12, and I barely have memories. I have some. But from then on, I only know Ukraine that wants to be in the EU, that has its problems but is actively fighting them. And so for us, for this generation, what Zelensky tried to do was just a betrayal of that guiding principle, right? Especially because doing something like that endangers Ukraine's European bid. And it was amazing. It was amazing to see these kids who could be doing anything on their Friday night, but they're standing there protesting. But I have to say the sort of the funniest, although also tragic, part of that I saw was some of the older people, adults, protesting with signs that said, "I can't believe I have to do this shit again." And that was just incredible. That summed up the Ukrainian spirit just better than anything, because we really do keep doing this shit over and over again. And it's tragic, but it's also pretty efficient, and that's the one thing that many Ukrainians will tell you. We have a lot of problems, but one thing we also have that, for example, Russia doesn't have, is we have a complete immunity to authoritarianism and dictatorship. And we could never be in a dictatorship. Ukraine could never be ruled by a dictator. And because it's a part of us on an instinctive level, and for years, because of the full-scale invasion and because of the nature of the situation, we were sort of keeping cool and trying to give the government the benefit of the doubt on all things. And we didn't protest, not because there was nothing to protest. Believe me, there were countless episodes of high-scale corruption, of mismanagement, of abuse of power. But when it got to some of these fundamental things, when it got to the guiding principle of Ukraine's future, which is that we are striving to be a part of Europe, and we're striving to be a country that fights corruption. When the government crossed that line, it became just too much. And even the kids who, on a day-to-day basis couldn't care less about what SAPO does. And, when we were kids, these bodies were created when we were kids. Even those people came out and protested, and it worked.
Yeah, and as we said, it was reversed, and now NABU and SAPO is independent again.
Yeah, there are still problems. There is still pressure.
Yeah, because there's an ongoing, spat between SBU, the security service of Ukraine, and the anti-corruption bureaus, because SBU's claims that anti-corruption bureaus are influenced by Russia somehow.
Like they have Russian spies or Russian moles, yes.
Yeah, and the anti-corruption bureaus are investigating top brasses of
the Ukrainian government.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the pressure continues because now, of course, the reason, it's kind of obvious to me, but the more I talk about this to Westerners, the more I realize that apparently it's not obvious to everyone else. But the government went after NABU and SAP because NABU were going after people close to Zelensky and close to the president's office, and he didn't want that. And there is now enough reporting and evidence to show that that's the reason, and that they were sort of closing in on some of top current and former aides or business associates of Zelensky. And they're still going after them, and there is still certain pressure being exerted. It is no longer so sort of out in the open, because now people are paying attention, and now ever since that bill was passed, and ever since those protests happened, sort of people now really care about this issue, even more than before. But they're trying to find other, more discreet ways to influence the investigation. So the problem, it didn't disappear. It is just now of a different character, and we need to be even more vigilant and pay even closer attention to what's happening in those agencies to make sure that they can do their job well.
Yeah, and I guess if the listeners want to keep themselves updated on this, Kyiv Independent is a great place to read about it. And does Lawfare Media write about this as well? Or?
Lawfare barely writes about this. We do have some pieces on Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts, and also we more often than not, we react to the news in Ukraine first by podcasting about it, because that's a much quicker way to do it. We have a daily podcast, Lawfare Daily, about all things, international coverage, American domestic issues, foreign policy. But so, for example, for Lawfare Daily, I did a podcast with a Ukrainian lawmaker, Anastasiia Lapatina, about this issue, if people want to hear a more in-depth description of what happened. On Lawfare Daily, I did an interview with Anastasiia Lapatina, who is not only a lawmaker in Zelensky's party, the party that overwhelmingly, almost unanimously voted for that bill, but she's also the head of the Parliament's Anti-Corruption Committee. And she was the first person to sort of spread the alarm about the bill, even though she's in Zelensky's party. So she was at the forefront of this fight from the very beginning. She knows the ins and outs of what happened and the history of these bodies. She was extremely interesting to talk to. And so I interviewed her. And if people want to learn more about it, you should go a little bit back in time on the Lawfare Daily feed and look for an episode again around Ukraine and the anti-corruption scandal that happened.
I will search it up myself at least.
Yeah.
It sounds very interesting. I think that's all we had time for today. If there's not something that we haven't mentioned that you want to put attention to.
I could go on and on, but I'm afraid we will need to do a whole separate show, a daily podcast for us to have time to unpack it. No, I think we're good.
Thank you so much for coming to Ukrainapodden, Anastasiia Lapatina.
Thank you so much for having me.
Lapatina.
It's okay. Everyone messes it up.
I'm sorry, but this one I should be able to say correct.
Yes.
Next time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.